She pressed both palms flat against Daisy's neck and felt the shudder move through the horse like a wave of surrender. 3 days without enough water, 3 days of dust and silence, and a road that gave nothing back. Clara Whitmore dropped her forehead against her horse's jaw and said out loud to nobody but the sky and the dead flat land around her, "Please don't leave me. You're all I have left." And that was the truth. That was the whole terrible, humiliating truth of her life in the summer of 1885. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow every part of Clara's journey to the very end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The gate was made of rough-cut pine and rusted iron wire, and it stood between Clara Whitmore and the only water she'd seen in 11 hours of riding. She could see the trough from where she sat in the saddle, a long, weathered wooden trough filled with water that caught the late afternoon light and turned it the color of hammered copper. Daisy smelled it before she saw it. The old mare's head lifted for the first time in 2 hours, her cracked nostrils flaring wide, and a low, desperate sound moved through her chest that Clara had never heard from a horse before. It wasn't quite a whinny. It was something older than that, something that came from a creature who had already accepted that she was dying and was surprised to discover she might not be. Clara steadied herself in the saddle and looked toward the ranch house. A man was standing on the porch. He was tall. She could tell that even at this distance, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from laziness, but from a life spent deciding carefully when to move and when not to. He had his arms crossed over his chest. He wore a dark hat that kept his face in shadow. He wasn't walking toward her. He wasn't waving her away. He was simply watching the way a man watches something he hasn't decided about yet. Clara's pride told her to ride on. Her pride had been the last thing left after the bank took the deed, after her sister-in-law packed the furniture into a wagon and drove away without looking back, after the lawyer in Tucson had looked at her with eyes full of pity and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do for you." Her pride had carried her through all of that. Her pride had kept her spine straight in the saddle when she wanted to fold over and weep. But Daisy was trembling, and Clara Whitmore was not going to let her horse die for the sake of pride. She swung down from the saddle too fast, her legs aching from 3 days of riding her boots hitting the hard earth in a way that sent pain up both knees, and she walked to the gate and put her hand on the latch. "That's a private gate, ma'am." His voice carried across the yard, the way voices do in that kind of country, where the land is so empty that sound has nowhere to hide. Clara looked up at him. He hadn't moved. He was still on the porch, still watching. "I know it is," she said. "My horse needs water. I'm asking permission." A silence stretched between them. In another kind of story, she might have begged. She might have wept or pleaded, or found some softer way to approach a strange man on a strange ranch in the middle of territory she barely knew. But Clara was 34 years old, and she had been through enough that begging felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She asked plainly. She waited plainly. She kept her eyes on him and her hand on the latch, and she let the question sit in the air between them without dressing it up. The man stepped off of the porch. He walked toward her with that same unhurried quality, each step deliberate, and as he came closer, she could see more of him, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the mountains behind the ranch. Dark eyes that moved from her face to Daisy's condition, and back again with the kind of quick, accurate assessment that came from spending years reading animals and weather and the intentions of strangers. He stopped on the other side of the gate. He looked at Daisy for a long moment. The horse's sides were heaving. Her coat was dull with dust and dried sweat. Her head hung low now, the brief surge of hope that the water smell had given her already fading back into exhaustion. Then the man unlatched the gate from his side and pushed it open. "Water's over there," he said. "You know where the trough is." Clara led Daisy through without another word. She guided the mare directly to the trough and stood beside her while she drank, one hand resting lightly on Daisy's neck to slow her down. A horse this dehydrated could hurt herself drinking too fast, and she kept her eyes on the water and not on the man who had followed and was now standing a few yards behind her watching. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "East of Tucson." "That's 3 days' ride." "I know how far it is." Another silence. Clara could feel him considering her, the trail dust caked into her dark dress, the sunburn across the back of her neck, the way her hands shook slightly against Daisy's mane. She hated being read that way. She hated the vulnerability of being seen when she hadn't chosen to show herself. "You got family in Bellow Creek?" he asked. That was the name of the town she'd been riding toward, a small ranching settlement another 2 hours down the road. "No," she said. "Friends?" "No." "Then what's in Bellow Creek?" Clara was quiet for a moment. Daisy drank steadily, the sound of it filling the silence between them. "I don't know yet," she finally said. "I'm hoping to find work, maybe a room, something to hold on to until I can figure out the rest." She heard him shift his weight. She didn't turn around. "There ain't much work in Bellow Creek for a woman alone," he said. It wasn't unkind, it was simply the truth delivered the way a man delivers weather forecasts, because facts about difficult conditions are still facts. "I've been told that before," Clara said, "about a lot of places." She heard something in the silence that followed, not quite a sound, more like a hesitation, like a man who had been about to say something conventional and then thought better of it. "You can stay the night," he said instead. "There's a room at the back of the house nobody's using. Your horse can have the stall on the end, it's empty." Clara turned around then. She looked at him directly, and he met her gaze without flinching. "I don't take charity," she said. "It ain't charity," he said. "I've got 6 horses in that barn, and nobody to help me check their legs tonight. My ranch hand's wife just had a baby, and I sent him home. You look like you know horses." Clara studied him. "I do know horses," she said carefully. "Then it ain't charity," he repeated. "It's a trade." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she gave a single brief nod. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. "Samuel Carter," he said. He didn't offer his hand, not yet, but he tilted his chin slightly in acknowledgement. "Come on, I'll show you the stall." That was how it started. With a dying horse, and a plain question, and a man who traded charity for dignity without being asked to. Clara Whitmore did not know, walking across that dusty yard toward the barn, with Daisy's reins in her hand, and Samuel Carter a half step ahead of her, that she would not be leaving in the morning. She told herself she would. She believed herself. She had been telling herself she would leave places for the past 8 months, ever since the morning she woke up to the sound of men her brother-in-law had hired arriving to change the locks on the house where she and Thomas had lived for 7 years. But the truth was that some places find you before you find them, and that ranch in the Arizona territory, dry and imperfect, and quietly holding itself together against the weight of everything the land demanded, had something in it that Clara would only recognize much later. She would only name it when she had already stayed long enough that leaving would have felt like walking away from herself. The barn was cool and dim after the hard afternoon sun. It smelled of hay and saddle leather, and the warm, uncomplicated presence of horses, and Clara felt something loosen in her chest the moment she stepped inside, something she hadn't known was clenched. Samuel showed her the stall at the end. Clean bedding, a fresh water bucket, already hung on the wall, the kind of small automatic care that told her something about the man without his having to say a word. A horse's stall tells you what its owner believes about the creatures in his care. "She'll need to drink slowly," Clara said, leading Daisy inside. "Another bucket in 2 hours, not before." "I know how to water a horse," Samuel said, but there was no edge to it. "I know you do," Clara said. "I'm telling you anyway, because she's mine, and I need you to know I've got my eye on it." Samuel looked at her again, with that same quiet, assessing quality. Then he almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but it was there in the slight shift around his eyes. "Fair enough," he said. She settled Daisy. She checked the mare's legs carefully, running her hands down each one, feeling for swelling or heat that would tell her the damage 3 days of hard riding had done. There was some. Not the worst she'd ever seen, but enough to confirm what she already knew. Daisy needed at least 2 days of rest before she could be ridden again. 2 days. Clara pressed her lips together and didn't say anything about it. She helped Samuel check the other horses, as she'd promised 6 of them all in good condition, which told her another thing about the kind of man he was. She checked legs and hooves and water levels, and said what she noticed without embellishment, and Samuel listened without interrupting, which, in her experience, was something not every man was capable of doing when the person speaking was a woman. By the time they walked back to the house, the sun was going down behind the mountains, and the sky had turned colors that had no business being as beautiful as they were. The kind of sunset that the desert produces with a complete indifference to whether anyone is there to see it. Samuel pushed open the back door of the ranch house and held it. "There's bread and cold beef left from this morning," he said. "It ain't much." "It's more than I've had today," Clara said. She sat at the plain wooden table in his kitchen while he brought out the food, and she ate without ceremony. Samuel sat across from her and ate too, and they didn't talk much, which Clara appreciated. She was too tired for talking that required performance, the kind of conversation where a woman alone in a strange man's house has to manage how she is perceived. Samuel Carter didn't seem to need her to perform anything. He ate his bread and he drank his coffee, and occasionally he looked out the window at his land in the gathering dark, and Clara had the peculiar sensation of being in the presence of someone who was not waiting for her to be something specific. It was a sensation she hadn't felt in a long time. After they ate, Samuel showed her the back room. It was small, a narrow bed, a washstand, a window with a curtain that had been washed so many times it had faded from whatever color it once was to a pale, quiet gray. But it was clean, and it was private, and when he said good night and pulled the door closed behind him, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself for the first time in 3 days to stop holding herself together. She didn't weep. She was past weeping. What she did was more like deflating a long, slow release of breath that seemed to carry 8 months of terror and exhaustion and desperate, grim forward motion with it. She sat there in the fading light with her hands in her lap, and she let herself feel how scared she had been. How close to the edge. How many times in the last 3 days she had looked out at the empty desert and thought thoughts she was not proud of. And then she had looked at Daisy, and kept riding. Because that was what you did. You kept riding. You kept your eyes forward and your spine straight, and you found the next water and the next road, and you kept going because the alternative was something she had not allowed herself to name. She lay down on the narrow bed without undressing, too tired to manage buttons, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about Thomas. Her husband had been dead for 14 months. 14 months of being a widow in a country that didn't know what to do with women who had no fathers, no brothers, no sons to put their name beside. Thomas had not been a perfect man. He'd had his troubles, his silences, the particular kind of stubborn pride that made asking for help feel to him like surrender. But he had loved her in the way that counted most, which was consistently and without conditions, and she had loved him back the same way, and when he died of fever in March of 1884. The ground had shifted under everything she thought was solid. Then came the will dispute. Thomas's brother Garrett had shown up 3 weeks after the funeral with a document and a lawyer and a certainty that the land had always been meant to come back to the family, by which he meant his family. The family, Clara had never quite been accepted into the family that had smiled at her at the wedding and waited 7 years for Thomas to come to his senses. The document turned out to be valid. The lawyer turned out to be better than any Clara could afford, and the judge turned out to be a man who had gone to school with Garrett's father. She had lost the land in October. She had lost the house in November. She had spent the winter in Tucson doing laundry and mending for the women at a boarding house, saving every coin, planning and replanning, trying to find a way to stay in a city that made her feel like a charity case, no matter how hard she worked. And then in June, the boarding house changed hands, and the new owner had a sister who needed the room Clara had been sleeping in, and just like that, she was on the road again with Daisy and a pack of her most important possessions, and the knowledge that she could not keep starting from nothing forever. Eventually, nothing ran out. She was almost out of nothing. She closed her eyes. She told herself 2 days. 2 days for Daisy to rest, and then she would be back on the road, and Bellow Creek was only 2 hours away, and there would be something there. There had to be something there. She fell asleep telling herself that. She woke to the sound of men's voices, not inside the house, outside in the yard, raised in the particular way that men raise their voices when they are trying to make someone feel small by demonstrating that they don't need to shout to be threatening. Clara lay still for a moment, listening, parsing the sounds through the pre-dawn dark. 2 voices she didn't recognize, and Samuel's voice, lower than the others, controlled, giving nothing away. She sat up. Through the curtain, the sky was just beginning to lighten at the edges. She got up, crossed to the window, and listened. "Been patient enough, Carter. Mr. Hale ain't a patient man by nature, and you've been trying that nature something considerable. Tell Mr. Hale that my answer hasn't changed." Samuel's voice was flat and very quiet. "This land isn't for sale." "That's a shame," the second voice said, and there was something in it that made the back of Clara's neck prickle. Not anger, worse than anger. The smooth, unhurried satisfaction of a man who already knows how something ends. "A real shame. A man alone out here, no help to speak of, that north fence already looking poorly. Lot of things can go wrong on a ranch like this." "Are you threatening me?" Samuel said. "Just making an observation," the first voice said, "about how things can go wrong." A silence. "Get off my land," Samuel said. There was a pause. Then the sound of horses. Then quiet. Clara stood at the window for a long moment after the sounds faded, her heart moving differently than it had a minute ago. That particular changed rhythm of someone who has just understood that she has arrived somewhere in the middle of something, not at the beginning of it. She thought about leaving. She thought about 2 hours down the road to Bellow Creek and whatever thin possibility waited there. Then she thought about the way Samuel Carter had opened that gate without asking her to justify herself. The way he'd called it a trade so she wouldn't have to accept charity. The way he'd let her eat in silence without requiring her to be grateful in any particular way. She thought about the men's voices in the yard. She thought about the north fence, which she had noticed yesterday. The boards weathered and split in 3 places, the kind of disrepair that didn't happen from laziness but from not having enough hands. She thought about Victor Hale. She didn't know who Victor Hale was yet, but she knew the shape of men like that. She had met that shape in her brother-in-law's lawyer and the judge, who hadn't quite met her eyes in every room where her presence was considered irrelevant to a decision that would determine her life. She had lost once. She sat down on the edge of the narrow bed in the gray pre-dawn light and folded her hands in her lap and thought about that. She had lost once because she'd been alone. Because she hadn't known soon enough what was coming. Because she hadn't understood the terrain until she was already standing in the middle of it, with the ground giving way beneath her feet. Outside, she heard Samuel come back inside. She heard the sound of him in the kitchen, the particular sounds of a man moving through a space he knows well, doing ordinary things because ordinary things are what you do when you refuse to let other men see that they've rattled you. Clara stood up. She went to the kitchen. Samuel was standing at the stove with his back to her, and he went still when she came in, but didn't turn around immediately. "I heard," she said. He turned then. His face was what she expected, composed, giving nothing away, except for something around his eyes that was not quite composure. She recognized it. She had looked at that same thing in her own mirror for 14 months. "It ain't your concern, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Maybe not," she said. "Who is Victor Hale?" Samuel looked at her for a moment, and she could see him deciding whether to answer. She held his gaze and waited. "He's the biggest landowner between here and Flagstaff," he said finally. "He's been buying up ranches in this valley for 3 years. Some men sold because he made it worth their while. Some sold because he made it not worth their while not to. And you won't sell." "This land belonged to my father," Samuel said. "And before that it belonged to the man my father worked for, who gave it to him because there was nobody else to leave it to. It ain't just land to me." "I understand that," Clara said quietly. Something shifted in Samuel's expression. Something brief and unguarded. "I know you do," he said. They stood in the kitchen in the thin early light, and Clara poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove without being invited to, and Samuel didn't say anything about that, and they drank their coffee in silence, while the sun came up outside the window and turned the mountains the color of things you try to remember. "I'd like to stay," Clara said when the coffee was half gone. "Not just the 2 days, longer than that. I can earn my keep. I know that, and I think you know it too. But I want to say it plain so there's no confusion about what I'm asking." Samuel looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You heard what's coming," he said. "You know this ain't going to be easy." "I know what hard looks like," Clara said. "I'm not afraid of it." A long moment passed. "You can stay," Samuel said, "long as you're willing to work." "I'm willing," Clara said. She did not tell him what she was thinking. She did not tell him that she had arrived at that ranch with nothing but a dying horse and the last scraps of her endurance, and that something in the last 12 hours had begun to feel for the first time in more than a year, like ground she might be able to stand on. She did not tell him that the sound of those men's voices in the yard before dawn had not frightened her the way they had perhaps intended. That instead, it had lit something in her that had been cold for a very long time, a specific particular heat that she associated with her father's voice, with the first time he had spread a surveying map on the kitchen table and said, "Clara, come look at this. You need to know what you're standing on." She did not say any of that. She refilled her coffee cup and asked Samuel what the most urgent work on the ranch was, and he told her and she listened, and that was the beginning. Not the beginning of a love story. Not yet. Not in any way that either of them would have named it then. The beginning of something more durable than that, and in some ways more necessary. Two people who had each been broken in different ways by the particular cruelties that life deals out to those who refuse to become cruel in return, finding themselves on the same piece of ground with the same enemy on the horizon and the same capacity for stubborn quiet, undefeated hope. Outside, the sun continued to rise. The mountains held their positions against the sky, and in the barn at the end of the building, Daisy drank her water slowly and carefully, the way living things drink when they have been thirsty for a very long time and have just begun to believe that the water will not be taken away. The first thing Clara did that morning, before the sun had fully cleared the mountains, was walk the north fence. She didn't ask Samuel's permission. She simply told him where she was going, picked up the pair of work gloves he had left hanging on a nail by the back door, and walked. She needed to see the land the way her father had taught her to see it, not as scenery, not as something to admire, but as a system, a set of conditions with problems embedded in them that had solutions if you were willing to look carefully enough. The north fence was worse than she had thought from a distance. 3 sections were not just weathered, they were deliberately compromised. She could tell the difference. When a fence board rots from weather, it fails gradually, the wood softening and splitting in patterns that follow the grain. These boards had been split against the grain in at least 2 places. Clean breaks at the post base where the wire had been cut, and then partially reattached badly enough that it would hold for a day or two before giving way entirely. Clara crouched in the dirt beside the 3rd section and ran her finger along the cut wire. Her jaw tightened. She stood up and walked back to the ranch. Samuel was in the yard hitching a horse to the supply wagon when she came back. He looked up when she walked in through the gate. Something in the way she was moving made him stop what he was doing. 3 sections of your north fence have been cut, she said. Not broken, cut. 2 places the wire's been reattached sloppy enough that your cattle will find it in the next 48 hours. Samuel went very still. "When?" he said. "I don't know when. But it wasn't last night. The wood around the cuts is dried out. At least 3 or 4 days ago." He stared at her. "How do you know the difference between a cut and a break?" "My father was a surveyor," she said. "Before that he worked fencing crews in Kansas. He taught me that land is only as good as what you know about it." She pulled off the work gloves and held his gaze. "You have cattle. 30 head on the east pasture. If those fences go, they'll drift north toward Hale's land, and I'd bet my last dollar that Victor Hale knows exactly what's on the other side of that fence line waiting for strays." The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who hadn't considered this possibility. It was the silence of a man who had considered it and had been trying to figure out how to handle it alone, which was the only way he knew how to handle things. "I'll fix the fence," he said. "We'll fix the fence," Clara said. "It'll go faster with two people, and I need something useful to do today, or I'll lose my mind sitting still." Samuel looked at her for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he unhitched the horse from the supply wagon. "I'll get the wire," he said. They spent the morning on the north fence. Clara worked beside Samuel in a silence that was different from the silence of strangers, more efficient, more comfortable than it had any right to be given that they had known each other for less than 24 hours. She held the wire while he twisted it. She steadied the posts while he tested their weight, and when she found a fourth compromised section that he'd missed, she called out to him without ceremony, and he came without hesitation, and they fixed it together. Around mid-morning, Samuel's only remaining ranch hand arrived a young man named Pete Hadley, barely 19, with an honest face and the hands of someone who'd been working since he was old enough to carry a bucket. He pulled up on his horse and looked at Clara with undisguised confusion. "Pete," Samuel said without looking up from the wire. "This is Mrs. Whitmore. She'll be helping out for a while." Pete looked at Clara, then at Samuel, then back at Clara. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat with the automatic courtesy of a boy who'd been raised right. "Pete," Clara said. She nodded at the fence. "Can you check the east line today? All of it post to post. Same thing you're seeing here. Look for cuts, not breaks." Pete looked at Samuel. Samuel nodded once. "Yes, ma'am," Pete said, and turned his horse without another word. "He'll do what you tell him?" Clara asked, after Pete had ridden out of earshot. "Pete's smart enough to know good instruction when he hears it," Samuel said. He pulled the wire tight and twisted it. "You sounded like you knew what you were talking about. That counts for something." "But not everywhere," Clara said. "No," Samuel said. "Not everywhere." She understood what he meant. Out here, away from town on a working ranch with physical evidence in front of him, Samuel Carter could make his own judgments about competence. In town, in front of other men, in front of Victor Hale's people, that would be different. Clara had learned that distinction the hard way in courtrooms and lawyers' offices, and across kitchen tables, where important men had explained to her with practiced patience why her understanding of her own land was unfortunately not the relevant consideration. She tied off the wire and moved to the next section. "Tell me about Hale," she said. Samuel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful and even the voice of a man giving information rather than opinions. "Victor Hale came into this valley about 6 years ago. Nobody knew him. He had money enough of it that people didn't ask too many questions about where it came from. Started buying land. First the small places, the ones where families had been struggling, made them fair offers. Mostly, though, fair is relative when a man's desperate. Then the medium places. Then he started getting less fair." Samuel paused. "The Donahue Ranch 3 miles east. Tom Donahue ran cattle there for 20 years. Last spring his barn burned down. No explanation, no evidence. 6 weeks later he sold to Hale for a third of what the land was worth, because he didn't have the money to rebuild and nobody in town would lend it to him." Clara's hands had stopped moving. "Did anyone investigate the fire?" "The sheriff's name is Roy Aldous," Samuel said. "Victor Hale donated the money for the building his office sits in." Clara absorbed this. She had known before he said it what the answer would be. She had known because she had sat in a courtroom in Tucson and watched a judge avoid her eyes while reading a decision that gave her husband's land to a man who hadn't earned a single acre of it. And she had understood in that moment that the machinery of legitimate authority could be operated by illegitimate men without anyone being required to acknowledge the difference. "What does he want with your land specifically?" she asked. "Water," Samuel said. "My father chose this land because of the water table. There's more underground water running beneath this property than almost anywhere else in the valley. Hale's been buying up dry land on cheap, but it's useless without water. He needs this ranch to make the rest of his holdings viable." "Does he know exactly what's under here?" He knows enough. How does he know? Samuel went quiet. Clara looked at him. That's a question I've been asking myself, he said finally. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the fence line. Somewhere in that answer was something important, a gap in exposure, something that Hale knew that he shouldn't know unless someone had told him. She filed it away. She didn't push. Not yet. They finished the north fence by midday. Pete returned from the east line, with confirmation of what Clara had feared. 2 more sections compromised same pattern. Samuel's expression when Pete described it was the expression of a man adding up numbers and not liking the total. It's not random, Clara said when Pete had gone to water his horse. He's not trying to damage your fences. He's creating a situation where your cattle drift onto his land. Once they're there, he can claim them as strays, or he can use the trespass as leverage. Say your cattle damaged his property. Threaten legal action. Use it as a reason to get officials out here to look at your operation. Samuel looked at her. You figured all that from a fence. I figured that from knowing how men like Hale think, Clara said. They don't come at you directly. They create conditions. They manufacture consequences. Then they stand back and let the consequences do the work, so their hands stay clean. A beat passed. You've dealt with men like this before, Samuel said. Yes, Clara said. I lost. She said it plainly without apology or self-pity, and she watched him receive it the same way, not with pity, not with the automatic reassurance that people offered when they wanted to smooth over something uncomfortable. What would you have done differently? He asked. The question caught her off guard. Not because it was strange, but because nobody had ever asked her that. Not once in the 14 months since Thomas died. Not the lawyer, not her sister, not the women at the boarding house in Tucson. They had all offered sympathy or advice or quiet, well-meaning assessments of what she should do next. Nobody had asked her to evaluate what she'd already done. I would have understood the land before I tried to defend it, she said. I knew the house and the fields. I didn't know the deed structure, the water rights, the exact property boundaries. When Garrett's lawyer started asking specific questions, I didn't have specific answers. And in a courtroom, a woman without specific answers doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. Samuel nodded slowly. Do you know your land? She asked. The actual documents, the original deed, the boundary surveys, the water rights filings. They're in the house, he said. My father kept everything. I want to look at them, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. That afternoon at the kitchen table, Clara spread out the documents Samuel brought from the tin box his father had kept on the top shelf of the bedroom closet. There were deeds, hand-drawn survey maps, water rights certificates, correspondence with the Territorial Land Office going back to 1861. Some of it was in bad condition, water-damaged edges, faded ink. But the essential information was there, and Clara went through it methodically with the focused attention her father had given her as a child when he brought his work home and let her sit beside him while he worked. Samuel sat across the table and watched her work. He made coffee. He brought it to the table and set a cup beside her without interrupting her, and she drank it without looking up. Here, she said after about an hour. She turned a document around so he could read it. Your water rights filing covers the main creek and the north tributary, but your father also filed a claim in 1873 on a secondary source. It's listed here as a subsurface claim, which means groundwater. She tapped the document. Has anyone ever confirmed what this refers to? Specifically, Samuel leaned over the document, his brow furrowed. I knew about the creek rights, he said. I didn't know about this. Your father knew about something under this land, Clara said. He thought it was important enough to file a claim on it in 1873. If Hale knows about a water source on this property, and you don't know about it, that's a dangerous gap. How do we find out what it is? Clara sat back in her chair. She looked at the survey map his father had drawn, rough old, but made with the particular care of someone who understood what he was mapping. I need to walk the property, she said. All of it, with these maps. I need a few days. Samuel was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking about doing a survey," he said slowly. "I'm thinking about understanding what we're standing on before Victor Hale understands it better than we do," she said. The word "we" had come out without her planning it. She heard it in the air between them and didn't take it back. Samuel didn't comment on it either. He just looked at the map and said, "I'll come with you." For 3 days, they walked the property together. Clara carried the old survey maps and a compass she'd found in the tin box, and she compared what she saw against what her father's training told her to look for: changes in vegetation, subtle depressions in the earth, the way moisture gathered in certain low spots, even in the dry heat of summer. Samuel walked beside her and answered her questions about the land's history, about where water had appeared and disappeared over the years, about the places his father had always said held something he couldn't quite explain. Pete kept the daily operations running. He checked fences moved, the cattle watched the roads. Clara was discovering more capable than he looked. The capacity for quiet, reliable work that sometimes comes in young men who have been given real responsibility early and taken it seriously. On the second afternoon, something happened that changed the texture of everything. They were on the western edge of the property, where a dry creek bed cut through the rock. Samuel was showing her where the water had run as a boy tracing the old channel with his hand when he stopped talking mid-sentence. Clara looked up. 2 riders were on the ridge above them, watching. They weren't Pete. They weren't anyone from the ranch. They sat their horses without moving for a long moment, high enough up that their faces were in shadow. Then slowly, deliberately, one of them turned and rode back over the ridge. The other one stayed for another few seconds, long enough to make sure they'd been seen, being seen, and then followed. The silence they left behind had a different quality than the silence before. "Hale's men?" Clara asked. "Most likely," Samuel said. His voice was controlled, but his jaw was set in a way she was starting to recognize. "They've done this before, riding the boundary, making sure I know they're there." "They were watching where we were walking," Clara said. "They wanted to know what we were looking at." Samuel looked at her sharply. "You think they know what we're looking for?" "I think they know we're looking for something," she said. "Whether they know what it is depends on how much Hale already knows." She looked back at the dry creek bed. "We need to move faster. Whatever's under this land, we need to find it before he does." That night, Clara sat up late at the kitchen table with the survey maps and a stub of candle and thought through everything she knew about groundwater, about the geology her father had explained to her in terms a child could understand and an adult could build on. She thought about the subsurface claim Samuel's father had filed in 1873. She thought about the way the land changed on the western edge, the particular quality of certain rock formations, the dry creek bed that had been a real creek not so long ago. She thought about why Victor Hale needed this specific ranch in a valley full of ranches. She was still sitting at the table when Samuel came into the kitchen at midnight, unable to sleep, and found her there. He stopped in the doorway. "Clara." She looked up. In the candlelight, his face had the look of someone who had been lying in the dark, thinking about things he hadn't said. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said. She waited. 2 weeks before you arrived, I had a visit from a man, not Hale's usual people, somebody different, a geologist, or somebody pretending to be one. He rode up to the gate very politely and asked if he could look at the west pasture. Said he was doing a survey for the territorial government. Samuel paused. I let him. Clara was very still. For how long? 2 hours, maybe a little more. Did you watch him the whole time? A beat of silence. No, Samuel said. Clara closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, Samuel was watching her with the expression of a man who already knew what she was going to say and was waiting for her to say it anyway. He wasn't from the territorial government, she said. No, Samuel said. I don't think he was. He was mapping the west pasture for Hale, she said. He was looking for the same thing we're looking for. And he had 2 hours on this land without you watching him. She leaned forward. What's on the west pasture, Samuel, specifically? What is it about that piece of land? Samuel came to the table and sat down. He was quiet for a long moment, his hands flat on the surface, looking at the candle like it had something to tell him. "My father used to say there was a spring under the west pasture," he said finally. He called it the Buried Creek. He said it was the reason this land was worth having, that the water under the west pasture could irrigate the whole valley if someone ever figured out how to reach it. I thought it was... He stopped. I thought it was an old man story, the kind of thing you tell yourself about land to make it feel like more than it is. Clara was already looking at the survey map. Her finger found the location of the subsurface water rights claim his father had filed in 1873 and then traced it to the western edge of the property map. The 2 points aligned. Her father had taught her that land tells you things if you know how to listen. He had taught her that the stories people tell about land are often the oldest version of the same information that a surveyor's instrument would confirm if given the chance. He had taught her that what feels like myth is sometimes just memory that hasn't been verified yet. "Your father wasn't telling himself stories," she said. She looked up at Samuel. He knew exactly what was under there, and now Hale might know too. Samuel's hands pressed flat against the table. "How do we prove it?" he said. "Carefully," Clara said. "And quietly. And faster than Hale's next move." She pulled the map closer. Outside, the night was absolute, the particular deep dark of land without city lights where the stars are so bright they feel like pressure, and somewhere out past the fence line that she had helped repair in the direction of the western ridge where 2 riders had watched them from the shadow of the slope. Victor Hale was making plans for a piece of land he didn't own yet and intended to. Clara had lost once because she hadn't understood the terrain. She did not intend to lose again. She pulled the candle closer to the map and began to work. Clara did not sleep that night. She worked until the candle burned low, and then lit another one from the tin on the shelf, and she kept working because the map in front of her had stopped being a collection of old lines on faded paper and had become something she could read the way her father had taught her to read land as a language, as a set of statements that added up to a truth if you were patient enough to hear them out. By the time the sky outside the window began to gray at the edges, she had something. Not proof. Not yet. But the shape of proof, the outline of where it would be found if someone went to the right place, with the right knowledge and the right tools. She heard Samuel's door before she heard his footsteps. The particular creak of its 3rd board from the threshold, she had catalogued it automatically on her first night. And then he was in the kitchen doorway, dressed but not yet fully awake, taking in the table covered in papers, and the 2 burned-down candles, and Clara sitting in the middle of it all with the look of someone who had been somewhere very far away in her mind and was only just returning. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I found it," she said. He came to the table. She turned the survey map toward him and pointed to the western edge of the property where she had marked 3 specific points in pencil. "Your father's subsurface claim references a compass bearing from the old boundary marker on the west line. The language is archaic, but it's specific. He knew exactly what he was describing. If I'm reading this correctly, the underground spring runs from here." She tapped the first point, "to here along this fault line. The dry creek bed we were standing in yesterday. That's the surface expression of it. The spring didn't disappear. It went underground. Probably during the drought of 1864, there are records in the Territorial Land Office about aquifer changes that year." Samuel was leaning over the map. His shoulder was close to hers. "You can read all of that from this," he said. "My father surveyed water rights in Kansas and New Mexico for 15 years, she said. "He didn't have sons. He had me. He taught me everything because someone had to know it after him." She looked up. "The spring is there, Samuel. And if that fake geologist was any good at his job, Victor Hale already knows it too." Samuel straightened. He looked at the map for a long moment. "We need someone to confirm it officially," he said. "A real surveyor, someone with standing." "Yes," Clara said. "And we need him before Hale makes his next move. Because once Hale has documentation from his own people, he'll take it to whatever official he owns and file a competing claim. Probably on the grounds that the Carter family abandoned the subsurface rights. The 1873 filing hasn't been renewed in 12 years. That could be used to challenge its validity. Samuel's jaw tightened. How do you know about claim renewal requirements? Because that's exactly what Garrett's lawyer used against me, Clara said. A filing my husband's family had made 20 years before that nobody had renewed because nobody thought it needed renewing. It's not a mistake you make twice. The silence between them was different from all the silences before it. It had weight. It had the specific gravity of two people who have just understood that they are facing something larger than either of them anticipated, and who are deciding in that moment whether that understanding draws them together or pushes them apart. Samuel picked up the map. I know a man in Flagstaff, he said. A surveyor. His name is Edmund Greer. He's honest and he's good. He worked with my father 20 years ago. Can he come quickly? If I explain the situation, yes. Then send for him today, Clara said, and don't tell anyone in town why. Samuel looked at her. You think there's someone in town feeding information to Hale? He said. It wasn't quite a question. I think it's the most likely explanation for how Hale knew about the subsurface water, Clara said. That fake geologist didn't find the spring in 2 hours from the surface. Someone told him where to look. Someone who had seen your father's documents or heard him talk about the buried creek. Someone who knew this ranch well enough to know what was under it. Samuel set the map down carefully. Pete's been with me for 2 years, he said. He wouldn't. I'm not saying Pete, Clara said. I'm saying someone. It could be anyone, a worker from years ago, someone in town who overheard something, someone your father trusted, who's been feeding Hale information for longer than you know. She paused. Be careful who you talk to about Greer. Don't send Pete to town with the message. Go yourself. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, picked up his hat from the peg by the door, and left. Clara watched him ride out, and then she turned back to the map. She stayed at the table another hour, making careful notes in the margin of the survey in her own handwriting. The calculations, the compass, bearings, the references to the territorial land records she'd found in the tin box. She was building a record. If something happened to her, or to Samuel, or to the documents themselves, she wanted the reasoning to exist somewhere in a form that could be followed by someone who knew what to look for. Her father had taught her that too. When you found something important, he used to say, write down how you found it. The finding matters, but the path matters just as much, because the path is what someone else can follow. She was still writing when she heard the sound of a horse coming fast into the yard. Not Samuel's horse. Too fast, too uneven, the sound of a rider pushing hard. Clara was at the door before she'd decided to move. Pete pulled up in the yard with his face the color of flour, and his hat gone somewhere along whatever road he'd ridden. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, and his voice was doing something complicated, trying to be steady and failing at it. The east pasture fence is down. The cattle are gone. She took a breath. How many head? All of them that were on the east side. Maybe 2022. I was riding the line like you said, and I found the gap. It's a big one, not like the north fence. This one's been pulled clean out of the ground, posts and all. How long ago? I don't know. The tracks are fresh, but not maybe 2 hours, maybe 3. Which direction? Pete swallowed. North. Toward Hale's land. Clara stepped back inside, picked up the survey map, folded it precisely, and put it inside the front of her dress. Then she came back out. Saddle me a horse, she said. Pete blinked. Ma'am, a horse, Pete. Now, the fastest one in the barn. He went. She did not leave a note for Samuel. There was no time for notes. She knew where the cattle had gone, and she knew what it meant, and she knew that every hour those cattle spent on Hale's land was an hour that Victor Hale had to build whatever structure he intended to build around their presence. She had seen this play before. The ending only changed if you moved faster than the man running it. Pete helped her up, and she rode north. She found the cattle about a mile past the Carter property line, milling in a dry wash on land she recognized from the maps as Hale's eastern boundary. A narrow strip of rocky ground that functioned, she now understood, as a collecting point. Not accidentally. The wash was natural, but the way the fence had been taken down had directed the cattle here as surely as if someone had opened a gate and pointed. She sat her horse at the edge of the wash and looked at the cattle. Then she heard hoofbeats and turned and found herself facing 3 riders coming from the north. The man in the lead was not Victor Hale. He was Hale's foreman. She had heard Samuel describe him without knowing she was cataloging the description. A heavy-set man named Cord with a mustache and the particular expression of someone who is accustomed to being the most dangerous person in a conversation. "These your cattle, little lady," Cord said. He reined up about 20 feet from her, his 2 riders stopping on either side. "They belong to Carter Ranch," Clara said. She kept her voice even. "And they're on Hale land because your men pulled the fence out of the ground this morning. I'd like them back, and then I'd like to have a conversation about who's going to replace those fence posts." Cord smiled. It was the smile of a man who has just received an unexpected gift. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "These cattle have been on this land for the better part of the morning. Under territorial law, that makes them—" "Under territorial law," Clara said, "strays have to be held for a mandatory period, and the owner notified before any change of possession occurs. You haven't notified anyone. And your clock on that holding period doesn't start until a duly appointed officer records the trespass, which hasn't happened either." She paused. "Unless you're about to tell me you've already had the sheriff out here, in which case I'd like to know when he arrived, because that will form part of the timeline I'll be presenting to the Territorial Land Office." Cord's smile had gone away. "Who are you?" he said. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "I'm a partner at Carter Ranch." She had not discussed this title with Samuel. She claimed it now not because she had been given it, but because she needed it, and because in the 2 weeks she had been on that ranch, she had earned it in every way that mattered except the formal one. She would deal with the formal part later. "I've never heard of you," Cord said. "You will," she said. A beat of very charged silence. Then Cord's eyes moved to something behind her, and Clara turned in the saddle to find Samuel riding up hard from the south, Pete a length behind him. Samuel took in the scene in approximately 3 seconds, the cattle. Clara facing down, Cord and his riders the configuration of it all, and he pulled up beside Clara without a word, and looked at Cord with the expression of a man who has come to the end of something. "Cord," Samuel said. "Carter," Cord said. "Your woman's been making some interesting claims." "She's been accurate," Samuel said. "Every word she said is backed by territorial law. You know that as well as I do." He looked at the cattle. "I'll be taking my stock back now. Mr. Hale might have something to say about—" "Then Mr. Hale can come say it to me," Samuel said. "Directly, with a lawyer present, because I'm done having conversations through intermediaries." He looked at Cord steadily. "Are we going to have a problem?" A long moment passed. Cord looked at Clara, then at Samuel, then at Pete, who had positioned himself quietly to one side, and was watching everything with the contained alertness of a young man who has decided which side of something he is on. "No problem," Cord said finally. He wheeled his horse and his riders followed him north without another word. Clara released a breath she had been holding for approximately 10 minutes. Samuel looked at her. "Partner," he said. "I'll explain later," she said. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. Not anger. Something warmer than that and more complicated. "All right," he said. They drove the cattle back to Carter land. Pete rode the fence line to confirm the gap and temporarily patched it, while Samuel and Clara pushed the cattle through. The whole operation took the rest of the morning, and by the time they were done, the sun was high and ferocious, and everyone was covered in dust. Edmund Greer arrived 2 days later. He was a small man in his 60s with careful hands and a methodical quality that Clara recognized and respected immediately. He read the survey documents she had annotated with the unhurried attention of someone who never rushes a document because he knows that what's in documents is what matters in the end. When he finished, he looked at her over his reading spectacles. "Your interpretation of the bearing is correct," he said. "I'd have to walk the property to confirm the location, but the claim language describes a specific source, if it's still active." He paused. Underground water sources don't disappear. They change course, sometimes go deeper. But the water your father-in-law described in this filing. He caught himself looking at Samuel. Your father described this water doesn't just stop existing. How long will it take to confirm? Samuel asked. 2 days walking, another day to write the report. Greer looked at Clara. I'll need your calculations. They're good work. They're here, she said, and handed him the notes she had made at the kitchen table on the night she hadn't slept. Greer read them. He nodded several times. He set them down with the care you give something that is going to be important later. Where did you learn this? He said to Clara. My father, she said. He was a good teacher, Greer said. And that was the moment Victor Hale walked into Carter Ranch. He did not announce himself. He arrived with 2 men at his back and a confidence that suggested he had never been in a room or a yard where he was not automatically the most important person present. He was not what Clara had expected. Not large, not physically imposing. He was average in almost every physical dimension, the kind of man whose power was entirely constructed from other men's willingness to treat him as powerful. He had pale eyes and good clothes and the particular kind of smile that never reached the eyes, because it was never meant to. Samuel, he said, looking around the yard with the unhurried assessment of a man pricing something. I heard you had company. His eyes found Clara. And this must be the famous Mrs. Whitmore. Cord had quite a bit to say about you. Did he tell you about the fence? Clara said. Hale's smile didn't change. He told me about a misunderstanding. I'd like to hear how you understand it, Clara said. Something shifted in Hale's pale eyes. He was not accustomed to being answered that quickly by someone he had already categorized. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, and his tone took on a quality like a man explaining something to a child, measured and patient and utterly condescending. I respect that you've been helping Samuel here. I understand a widow in difficult circumstances needs to find a situation that suits her. But ranch business property matters. Legal matters, the kind of complex questions that arise between landowners. These things really aren't the place for someone who understands property law, Clara said, or for someone who disagrees with you. The yard went very quiet. Hale looked at her for a long moment. Careful, he said softly. I'm trying to be friendly. I don't need friendly, Clara said. I need you to answer a simple question. 3 weeks ago, a man identifying himself as a territorial government geologist arrived at this ranch and was given access to the west pasture. Can you tell me that man's name and the agency he represented? The smile was completely gone now. I don't know what because if he was from the territorial government, there'll be a record of his visit, Clara continued. A government surveyor files a report. I can request that report from the land office in 2 days' time. If it exists, no harm done. If it doesn't exist... She paused. Then we have a much more interesting conversation about what he was doing on private property under false pretenses. Hale looked at Samuel. Where did you find her? He said. She found me, Samuel said. I'm offering you a fair price for this land, Carter. Better than fair. I've told you my answer, Samuel said. Things change, Hale said. Circumstances change. A man alone out here, problems mounting up. His eyes moved to Greer, who had stepped out of the house at the sound of voices and was standing quietly at the edge of the porch with his survey equipment visible in his hands. Hale's gaze stopped on the equipment with the stillness of a man who has just seen something he was not supposed to see. Who is that Edmund Greer? Clara said. Territorial surveyor. He's here doing some work for us. The look on Victor Hale's face in that moment was the most informative thing Clara had seen since she arrived at Carter Ranch. It lasted less than 2 seconds before he put the smile back. But those 2 seconds told her everything she needed to know about how much he already knew and how close he had been to moving on it, and what the arrival of a legitimate surveyor meant to a plan that depended on the Carters not knowing what was under their own land. Well, Hale said, I'll let you get to it. He turned his horse. Mr. Hale, Clara said. He looked back. I want you to know something, she said. She kept her voice level, not angry, not threatening. Simply clear the way. Clear water is clear, because there is nothing in it obscuring the bottom. I have read every document in that tin box. I know what your fake geologist was looking for, and I know where it is, and I know what Samuel's father filed in 1873. I know what the renewal requirements are, and I know the 3-year window that is still within the filing period." She paused. "And I want you to know that I know all of it, because I think it's important for you to make future decisions with accurate information." Victor Hale looked at her for a very long time. Then he rode away without another word. The dust his horses raised hung in the air after he was gone. Pete let out a breath that was almost a word. Samuel stood very still. Edmund Greer came down from the porch and stood beside Clara and watched the road where Hale had disappeared. "He'll come back," Greer said quietly. "Yes," Clara said. Harder. "Yes," she said again. "You ready for that?" Clara looked at the road for a moment. She thought about a courtroom in Tucson where a judge had not met her eyes. She thought about the morning men came to change the locks on the house where she and Thomas had built 7 years of a life. She thought about 3 days in the desert with a dying horse and nothing left but the determination to keep moving. She thought about a gate swinging open. "I've been getting ready for it for 14 months, she said. Greer nodded once with the quiet respect of an old man who can recognize the specific quality of someone who has already survived the worst thing and discovered they are still standing. "Then let's get to work," he said. And they did. Edmund Greer walked the west pasture for 2 full days. Clara walked with him. Most of it not because he needed help, but because she needed to see what he saw to have his experienced eyes confirm or correct what she had worked out at the kitchen table in the small hours of the morning with 2 burned candles and her father's voice in her memory. Greer did not mind her company. He was the kind of man who had spent so many years working alone in open country that another person who knew how to be quiet registered more as companionship than intrusion. Samuel stayed close to the ranch buildings. He was not a man who could walk slowly across his own land, while everything he had built felt like it was balanced on a wire, but he understood that the work Greer was doing required patience, and so he channeled his energy into the things that needed doing. Reinforcing the repaired fence sections, reorganizing the cattle between pastures, watching the roads. Pete watched the roads too from the North Ridge, and twice in those 2 days came back to report that Hale's riders had been seen on the far boundary without crossing it, waiting. On the evening of the second day, Greer sat down at the kitchen table with his instruments and his notes and his careful, unhurried hands, and said to Samuel and Clara, "It's there." Samuel went very still. Clara felt something move through her chest that was not quite triumph too weighted with everything that had led to this moment to be anything as clean as triumph. "Where exactly?" she asked. "Right where your calculations put it," Greer said. He looked at her with the same quiet respect he'd shown in the yard when Hale rode away. "The fault line runs northeast to southwest across the western third of the property. The spring is at depth maybe 40 feet down at its shallowest point, but it's active. I can tell from the surface vegetation patterns and the moisture readings I took this afternoon. This isn't a dead source. This is running water." He paused. "A lot of it," Samuel said. "How much is a lot?" Greer looked at him steadily. "Enough to irrigate 3 times the acreage you're currently running. Enough to supply every ranch in this valley and have water left over." Another pause. "Enough that a man who controlled access to it would control this valley." The kitchen was quiet. "Which is why Hale wants it," Clara said. "Which is why Hale has wanted it for a long time," Greer said. "This isn't recent. A man doesn't set up the kind of operation Hale has set up, buying land, placing informants, sending fake government surveyors in a few months. This has been years in the making." He looked at Samuel. "Your father knew what he had. I think he knew exactly how valuable it was. The question is why he never developed it." Samuel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had something underneath it that Clara recognized the particular weight of a son trying to understand a father. "He was afraid of what it would attract," Samuel said. "He used to say that some things were better left quiet, That a man who showed too much had to spend all his energy defending what he'd shown. He stopped. I thought he was being modest, or superstitious. He was being accurate, Clara said quietly. Samuel looked at her. He understood the situation, she said. He just hoped that not naming it would protect it. That if he kept the claim filed but quiet, kept the land working, but didn't advertise what was underneath it. She stopped. It was a reasonable strategy for as long as it worked. It stopped working when Hale arrived, Samuel said. Yes. The three of them sat with that for a moment. Then Greer said, I'll have my written report by tomorrow morning. Formal documentation of the spring's location dimensions, likely output, and confirmation of the 1873 claim's continued applicability under current territorial law. He looked at Clara again. Your work on the claim renewal window was correct. You have 14 months before the question becomes legally complicated. Plenty of time to file the renewal and make it unassailable. But we need to file before Hale does anything to challenge it, Clara said. You need to file this week, Greer said. The land office is in Flagstaff, Samuel said. 2 days' ride. I'll take the documents myself when I go back, Greer said. I have standing there. The report and the renewal filing together from a certified surveyor on record, that's harder to challenge than a private citizen walking in alone. Clara looked at Samuel. He was looking at the table. There's still the question of the informant, she said. Both men looked at her. Hale has known too much for too long, she said. The fake geologist knew where to look. Hale knew about the subsurface claim he had to, or he wouldn't have sent someone specifically for the West pasture. Someone with access to this ranch or to your father's records has been feeding him information. She looked at Samuel. You said your father kept everything in that tin box. He did. Who knew about the box? Samuel thought. Anyone who was ever in the house. Ranch hands over the years. People from town he invited for a meal. He paused. The doctor who came when he was sick the winter before he died. When did Hale start making offers on this property? Samuel's expression shifted. About 6 months after my father died. Clara nodded slowly. So either someone told Hale what was in that box, or someone with access to it told him about the spring directly. Your father's description of the buried creek, who did he tell? He told everyone, Samuel said, and there was something painful in how he said it. He talked about the buried creek the way some men talk about a river they fished as a boy, like it was part of who he was. He told it at the general store at church over supper. He didn't think anyone was listening for profit. Someone was, Clara said. A silence. Jim Aldous, Pete said. Everyone turned. Pete was sitting at the far end of the table, where he'd been so quiet for so long that the adults had half forgotten he was there. His young face was troubled in a way that looked like it had been troubled for some time, like a man who has been carrying something he didn't know whether to put down. Pete, Samuel said carefully. What do you know? Pete looked at his hands. Then he looked up at Samuel with the directness of someone who has decided that what he owes the truth is more than what he owes his own comfort. Jim Aldous is the sheriff's nephew, Pete said. He worked here before my time, I think maybe 3 or 4 years back. And he works for Hale now. Has for about 2 years. He paused. I didn't think anything of it at first. Men change jobs. But last month I was in town getting supplies, and I saw Jim coming out of Hale's office, and the way he looked when he saw me like he'd been caught. I didn't know what to make of it. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. Samuel looked at Pete for a long time. Not with anger, with something more complicated than anger. The look of a man recalculating a history he thought he understood. How long ago did Jim work here? He asked. Mabel at the store told me 3 years, Pete said. Maybe 3.5. She said he left sudden, 3.5 years ago. 1.5 years before Samuel's father died. Long enough to have heard the buried creek story. Long enough to have looked at the contents of the tin box if it was ever left unattended. Long enough to have given Victor Hale everything he needed to build a plan around a piece of land he hadn't yet figured out how to take. He's connected to the sheriff, Clara said. Who's connected to Hale? Samuel said. Which means if we go to the sheriff with any of this, we don't go to the sheriff, Samuel said flatly. We never go to the sheriff. No, Clara agreed. We go above him. She looked at Greer. The Territorial Land Office, she said. And is there a federal circuit judge who covers this district? Greer nodded slowly. Judge Harlan Moss. He comes through Flagstaff every quarter. He's not in Hale's pocket. I can say that with some confidence. I've appeared before him. When is his next circuit? Greer thought. 3 weeks, maybe 4? That might be enough time, Clara said. If we have Greer's report filed with the land office this week, and we document everything that's happened, the fence cutting, the fake surveyor, the cattle trespass, the threatening visits, we have a record of a pattern. That pattern presented to a federal judge by a certified surveyor, alongside documented property rights and a renewed water claim, is a very different conversation than one rancher complaining about his neighbor. Samuel was watching her. He had been watching her for most of the conversation, and the quality of his watching had changed somewhere in the last hour from the way he had watched her when she first came in from the desert, assessing cautious, carefully fair to something she didn't have a name for yet and wasn't ready to name. You've been planning this since that first morning, he said. I've been planning since I understood the terrain, she said. That's what my father taught me. You don't start planning until you know what you're standing on. Samuel looked at the map between them on the table, at the pencil marks she had made 2 nights ago in the hours she didn't sleep, at the notes in her careful handwriting along the margins. He said quietly, I couldn't have done this alone. I know, she said. And you couldn't have done it with just anyone. You needed someone who understood land and documents and the way men like Hale operate. She paused. I needed somewhere to stand that was worth standing on. The kitchen was very quiet. Greer picked up his notes and excused himself to his room with the tactful invisibility of a man who knows when he is the unnecessary person in a room. Pete followed him with a brief glance at Samuel and Clara that contained an entire editorial in approximately a half-second. Samuel and Clara sat at the table alone. He said after a moment, Tell me about Thomas. She looked at him. It wasn't a question she had expected, and the fact that it wasn't what she expected made it land differently than questions she was prepared for. He was a good man, she said. Not perfect. Stubborn in ways that cost him sometimes, but honest and consistent, and he loved me without requiring me to be smaller than I was. She paused. That's rarer than it should be. Samuel nodded. He was looking at the candle in the center of the table. My wife's name was Alice, he said. She died in the winter of '79. My daughter, too. They got sick within a week of each other. I was out riding the range when it started, and by the time I got back... He stopped. He pressed his lips together. By the time I got back, there wasn't much left to come back to, except the land. So I stayed with the land. Clara didn't say she was sorry. She had been on the receiving end of too many sorries to believe they did much, and she thought Samuel was the same kind of person, someone for whom the ritual of condolence felt like a door closing rather than opening. Instead, she said, what was she like? And Samuel, for the first time since she had arrived for what she suspected was the first time in a very long time, talked about Alice. About the way she laughed at things that weren't quite finished being funny yet. About how she had strong opinions about which direction to plant and was always right. About how she used to hum without knowing she was doing it when she was concentrating on something. Clara listened. She didn't look at him while he talked because sometimes a person speaks more freely when they don't feel watched, and she had learned this from her father, who would describe the land in the dark of the wagon at night in a way he never would have if the sun were up and someone were looking at him. When he finished, they sat in the comfortable silence that had been building between them since the first morning, the kind of silence that is not absence, but presence, the particular peace of two people who have stopped requiring anything of each other beyond exactly what the other person is. Then Clara said, We need to be ready for what comes next. What do you think comes next? Hale knows Greer is here. He knows we know about the spring. He has days, maybe less, before Greer files in Flagstaff. He'll move before that if he can. She looked at Samuel steadily. He'll try something. Not the fence cutting and cattle drifting. Those are preliminary moves, testing moves. What comes next will be more serious. How serious? She thought about the Donahue Ranch, the barn that burned down with no explanation and no evidence. Serious, she said. Samuel's jaw tightened. Pete can sleep in the barn, he said. Pete should, she agreed. And I want to go through everything in that tin box one more time tonight. Make a complete inventory, note the condition of everything. If something gets damaged or goes missing, I want to be able to state specifically what was there before. You think someone would come for the documents? I think a man who's built 3 years of a plan around information from those documents understands exactly how important they are, she said. And I think now that we've shown our hand, he'll want to neutralize the evidence before Greer leaves for Flagstaff. They worked until midnight again. This time, Samuel sat with her, and it was his handwriting on the inventory alongside hers, and the tin box documents were counted and described, and the most critical ones were wrapped in oilcloth from the kitchen shelf and put in a place that Clara chose and did not tell anyone about. Not Pete, not even Greer, because her father had also taught her that the safety of a thing depends on how few people know exactly where it is. The attack came on the third night. Not fire, not the fences. Something that in some ways was worse because it was clever. Clara woke to a sound she couldn't identify, lay still for one precise moment parsing it, and then was out of bed and in the hallway before she had time to be afraid. The sound was coming from outside the front of the house. Not the barn, the front where there was nothing that should be making sounds at 2 a.m. She went to the front window and looked out. 2 men moving fast and quiet. One at the corner of the house with something in his hands, a saddlebag or something the size of one. The other one watching the road. She went to Samuel's door and knocked twice hard. He was in the hallway in 4 seconds. He had a rifle. 2 men, she said low and fast. Corner of the house, not the barn. They're putting something there, not taking anything. Samuel's eyes sharpened. He understood immediately, not thieves, not fire. Something else. Get Greer out of the house, he said. What are they doing? I think I know, he said, and his voice had a quality in it that she had not heard from him before. Not fear, something colder. There's an old trick where a man places cattle on another man's land in the dark and then reports finding them in the morning. Same principle works with a different kind of evidence. He looked at her hard. Get Greer. She got Greer. She woke him in 5 words, and he was coherent instantly, the way old men who've slept outdoors most of their lives wake up fully without confusion. Samuel went out the back. What happened in the next 10 minutes was something Clara only understood in pieces from sounds, and then from Samuel's account afterward. He came around the east side of the house and found the 2 men in the act of positioning what turned out to be a falsified bill of sale. A document purporting to show that the water rights described in the 1873 filing had been sold by Samuel's father to a third party in 1880, which would invalidate the current claim entirely. They had planned to place it somewhere on the property where it would be found by Hale's sheriff connection in the morning during a convenient inspection. Samuel came around the corner with the rifle and a voice like bedrock. Drop it, he said. They ran. He let them go. He picked up the document. When he brought it inside and laid it on the table, Clara and Greer examined it in silence. It was good work, aged paper-passable handwriting. A notary seal that looked official until you studied the date format, which used a convention that wasn't adopted by the territorial government until 1883. 3 years after the document claimed to have been created. Clara pointed at it. Greer looked. He closed his eyes briefly and then opened them. Forgery, he said. A careful one, but forgery. Can you prove it? Clara asked. To a federal judge, Greer said. Yes, the date format is anachronistic. Anyone with knowledge of territorial government document conventions can demonstrate that. He paused. And the fact that men were on this property in the middle of the night placing a document in a position to be found, that's a crime. That's something a federal judge takes seriously. Clara looked at the forged document on the table. He's scared. she said. Both men looked at her. Victor Hale is scared, she said again. She wasn't gloating, she was working, reading the evidence the way her father had taught her to read a survey for what it actually said, rather than what she wanted it to say. This is a desperate move. Careful men don't send people in the night to plant forged documents on a property that's being actively watched unless they're running out of time. She looked at Greer. He knows you're about to leave for Flagstaff. He knows what you'll file when you get there. He's trying to get ahead of it, which means the forged document has to arrive at the land office before I do, Greer said slowly. Filed by someone with standing. Someone official. The sheriff, Samuel said. Yes, Clara said. He'll have Aldous swear out some kind of complaint in the morning trespass, some invented grievance, and use it as grounds to have a deputy come out here and discover the document. Then Aldous walks it to Flagstaff himself. She straightened. Greer, how early can you ride tomorrow? Greer looked at her steadily. Before dawn, he said. Then you leave before dawn, she said. Tonight, before you sleep, write down exactly what you've seen and sign it and date it. Everything the spring, the survey results this document. The men in the yard, the time, the date. All of it. She picked up the forged bill of sale. And you take this with you, because a forged document is evidence. Evidence of a conspiracy to defraud. That's a serious charge, Greer said. It's a serious crime, Clara said. A beat of silence. Samuel was looking at her with an expression she felt rather than saw the weight of it at the side of her face like warmth from a fire. She turned to look at him. His eyes said something that his voice was not yet ready to say. She understood it anyway the way she had come to understand most things about this man, not from what he showed, but from the shape of what he held back, the outline of it, the way restraint in a person who is capable of feeling deeply tells you more than expression in someone who feels shallowly. She looked away before either of them had to deal with it. Let's get to work, she said. They worked through what was left of the night. Greer wrote. Clara organized the Carter documents into 2 sets, one for Greer to take, one to keep secured in the place she had chosen and not told anyone about. Samuel sat at the table and wrote out his own account in the plain, precise handwriting of a man who learned to write from necessity and never embellished. At 4 a.m, Greer saddled his horse and rode north toward Flagstaff with the evidence of 40 years of Carter history and the proof of Victor Hale's desperation packed carefully in his saddlebags. Clara and Samuel stood in the yard and watched him go. The night was the specific cool of Arizona in August, before the sun arrives, to remember what month it is, and the stars were still the way they get before dawn, very bright and very near. Samuel said, "Whatever happens next, I want you to know something." She waited. "The morning you came to my gate," he said, "I almost didn't open it." She looked at him. "I'd had a bad few weeks," he said. "Hale's people had been out twice. Pete had come to me about something he'd heard in town that I didn't know what to do with. I'd been up most of that night with one of the horses." He paused. "When I saw you at the gate, I thought I'm in no position to take on someone else's trouble." "What changed your mind?" she asked. "Your horse," he said simply. "The way she was standing. The way you had your hand on her neck." He stopped. "A person who loves something that much, who crosses the desert for it, rather than leave it behind, that's not someone whose trouble is the kind you should turn away." Clara held very still. "I'm glad you opened the gate," she said. "So am I," he said. They stood in the yard as the stars began to fade, and the mountains began to take back their shapes from the dark, and whatever was between them, still unnamed, still careful, still surrounded by more pressing things, grew a little more solid in the way that real things grow solid, not all at once, but by accumulation, like water, finding its level, like ground, revealing itself as the flood recedes. In Flagstaff, Edmund Greer was riding through the dark, and at Carter Ranch, 2 people who had each lost the life they thought they were going to have stood in the cooling air of an August pre-dawn and understood without saying it that something was being built on this ground. Not just the case against Victor Hale. something more permanent than that. The morning after Greer rode for Flagstaff, Victor Hale made his move. It came before breakfast, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, before Clara had finished the first cup of coffee she had poured with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be after a night with no sleep. She heard the horses first, not one or two the way Hale's men usually came, but several, and the sound of a wagon underneath them, the particular creak and rattle of something official. She set down her cup. "Samuel," she said. He was already at the window. Sheriff Roy Aldis came through the gate with 4 deputies and a man Clara didn't recognize, a thin man in a city suit, who carried a leather satchel, and looked at the ranch yard with the assessing eyes of someone who has been sent to perform a function, not to make judgments. Behind them came one of Hale's riders leading a spare horse, and behind that, in his own time at the pace of a man who has decided how a day will end before it has begun, came Victor Hale. Samuel went to the door. Clara was right behind him. Aldis pulled up in the yard and looked at Samuel with the professionally neutral expression of a man who has learned to perform authority without committing to it. "Samuel Carter," he said. "I have a complaint filed this morning alleging fraudulent misrepresentation of water rights. I'm here to conduct an inspection of the relevant documents." "On whose complaint?" Samuel said. "That's a legal matter." "Whose complaint, Roy?" Samuel said. Not a question this time. Aldis's eyes moved briefly to Hale and back. Clara stepped forward. "Sheriff Aldis," she said, "I'm Clara Whitmore, a partner at Carter Ranch. Before you proceed with any inspection, I'd like to know the specific legal basis for this action, the name of the complainant, and whether you have a written order from a judge authorizing an inspection of private property and private documents." Aldis looked at her. He had the expression of a man who has rehearsed a scene and is now finding that the other actors have not read the same version of the script. "Ma'am, this is a legal proceeding, and I'd ask you to—" "That's not an answer to any of my 3 questions," Clara said. Behind Aldis, one of the deputies shifted his weight. The man in the city suit cleared his throat. Hale, still on his horse at the back of the group, watched with his pale eyes and said nothing. "The complainant is Mr. Victor Hale," Aldis said finally. "The complaint alleges that documents proving a transfer of water rights from the Carter estate in 1880 have been concealed or destroyed. As sheriff, I have the authority to investigate. Under territorial law, sheriff, an investigation of private property documents requires either consent of the property owner or a judicial order," Clara said. "Do you have one?" A beat of silence. "I have the authority." "You have the authority to knock on the door and ask," Clara said, "which you've done. Samuel Carter's answer is no. You may not inspect our documents without a court order." She paused. "If Mr. Hale has evidence of a document transfer in 1880, he is welcome to present that evidence to a judge. We will welcome that conversation because it will give us the opportunity to present our own evidence in the same proceeding." The yard was very quiet. Aldis looked at Hale. Hale walked his horse forward until he was at the front of the group. He looked at Clara for a long moment, and she looked back at him. And whatever passed between them in that moment was not the exchange of 2 people who disliked each other. It was something more specific than that. It was the exchange of 2 people who have recognized in each other the particular quality of someone who does not stop. "You are one woman," Hale said. His voice was very quiet. "On one piece of land. And I have been building toward this valley for 6 years. I want you to think carefully about whether the correct decision is to stand in my way." "I have thought carefully," Clara said. "My answer is that this land has a documented water claim filed in 1873, renewed within the legal window, supported by a certified survey conducted in the last week by Edmund Greer of Flagstaff, and that any document suggesting a transfer of those rights in 1880 is a forgery. I know it's a forgery because I watched 2 of your men attempt to place it on this property in the middle of the night 3 nights ago." She kept her eyes on his. "And Edmund Greer is in Flagstaff right now presenting all of that to the Territorial Land Office, along with the forged document itself, and a request for federal judicial review of your 6 years of activity in this valley. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before in this yard. Hale's face did not change. Men like Hale train their faces not to change. But something in the air around him changed, a pressure shift, the way the air changes just before a weather system moves through a drop in temperature that has nothing to do with the thermometer. "You're bluffing," he said. "Greer left before dawn," Samuel said from just behind Clara's left shoulder. His voice was flat and entirely certain. "He's been riding for 6 hours. He'll be in Flagstaff by this afternoon." Another silence. Longer. Then Hale looked at Aldous. Aldous looked at his saddle horn. "Roy," Hale said. Aldous looked up. And Clara saw in that moment the specific quality of a man who has spent a long time in someone else's orbit and is only now under the particular pressure of a moment he didn't anticipate feeling the pull of the fixed point he had originally been before that orbit began. Aldous was not a villain. He was something smaller and sadder than that, a man who had made an arrangement that seemed manageable until it wasn't, and who was now standing in a yard facing a woman who had just named what the arrangement was out loud in front of witnesses. "I think," Aldous said carefully, "that this matter may be better handled through the courts." "Roy," Hale said. "I don't have a court order," Aldous said. "I can't compel an inspection without one. That's the law." He looked at Hale with something in his face that was not quite apology and not quite defiance, but existed in the narrow territory between them. "I'm the sheriff. I follow the law." It was possibly the first fully true thing Roy Aldous had said in a year. Hale looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. Then at Samuel. Then he turned his horse and rode out of the yard without another word. Aldous and his deputies followed. The man in the city suit followed. The spare horse followed. And then the yard was empty of everyone but Samuel and Clara and Pete, who had appeared from somewhere during the confrontation and was standing by the barn with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face like a man watching a storm pass that he wasn't sure was going to. Pete said, "Is it over?" "Not yet," Clara said. But it had shifted. Something had shifted. The next 3 weeks were the longest and shortest of Clara's life, simultaneously long, because every day held the specific anxiety of waiting for news from Flagstaff, of watching the roads for signs of Hale's next move, of living in the heightened alertness of people who know they are in a fight that is not finished. Short, because the days were full of work. Real work, the kind that fills your hands and your mind and leaves no room for the particular spiral of worry that only finds you when you stop moving. Clara and Samuel worked the ranch together in a rhythm that had nothing self-conscious in it anymore. She had stopped thinking about leaving in the way she had thought about it in the first days, the 2 days then the road calculation she had run in her mind like a kind of protective distance. She had stopped thinking about Bellow Creek and whatever thin possibility might have been waiting there. She had stopped measuring her presence at Carter Ranch in terms of how long she had been there and started measuring it in terms of what needed doing next. She was standing in the west pasture 11 days after Greer left when she heard the horse coming fast up the road. She knew before she turned that it was not a threat. The rhythm was wrong for trouble too direct, no slowing at the boundary, the pace of someone with news who does not want to lose time. It was Pete coming back from town where Samuel had sent him for supplies. "Letter," Pete said, breathing hard, even though it was his horse that had been running. "At the general store, from Flagstaff." She took the letter from his hand and looked at the return address. Edmund Greer, Territorial Land Office, Flagstaff, Arizona Territory. She held it for a moment without opening it. Then she walked to the house. Samuel was in the kitchen when she came in. He saw what was in her hand and went still. She set the letter on the table between them. He looked at it, then at her. "You open it," he said. She picked it up and broke the seal. The letter was 2 pages in Greer's careful handwriting. She read it once through to herself quickly, her eyes moving faster than she usually allowed herself to read, because her hands had started doing the thing again, where they couldn't quite stay still. Then she set it down and looked at Samuel. The water claim renewal has been accepted and filed, she said. It's on record as of 4 days ago. Greer's survey report is filed alongside it as supporting documentation. She paused. The forged bill of sale was examined by the Land Office archivist, who confirmed the anachronistic date formatting. They've referred the matter to the federal prosecutor's office for investigation of fraud. Another pause. And Judge Harlan Moss moved his circuit schedule forward. He arrives in Bellow Creek in 8 days. Samuel sat down. He sat down in the chair at the kitchen table, the chair that had always been his father's chair, the chair he had sat in alone for 6 years, eating meals and drinking coffee and making decisions that nobody else was there to help him make. And he put both hands flat on the table, the way Clara had seen him do when he was containing something large. His eyes were bright. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried, and this was not a moment for crying anyway. It was a moment for something more complicated than relief, something that lives underneath relief, the specific feeling of a thing that you have held up for a very long time, beginning slowly to be held by something outside yourself. Clara sat across from him. Your father was right, she said quietly. About the land, about the water, about all of it. Samuel looked at her. He was right about a lot of things I didn't give him enough credit for. We usually are, she said. About our parents. We figure it out too late to tell them. Yeah, he said. Just that. They sat in the kitchen in the afternoon light, and the letter lay on the table between them, and neither of them said anything for a while because some moments are complete without words, and both of them were old enough to know the difference. The 8 days before Judge Moss arrived were not quiet. Hale's movements in town became erratic, the kind of erratic that happens when a man who has been operating from a position of confidence finds that confidence reorganizing itself under him. There were reports from Pete, from the woman at the general store, who had taken a liking to Clara and begun passing information along with the casual reliability of someone who has been waiting for a reason to stop cooperating with a man she had never liked. Hale was in the sheriff's office twice. He sent riders to 2 of the ranches he owned north of town. The man in the city suit was seen leaving on the Flagstaff stage. He's covering his exposure, Clara told Samuel on the 5th evening. He's not mounting a new attack. He's protecting himself from the one that's coming. Is that better or worse for us? Better, she said. A man in defense is not a man pressing forward. Whatever he'd been planning next, another forged document, something worse, he's shelved it. He's trying to limit his losses. What are his losses? Clara thought. The fraud referral is the serious one. If the federal prosecutor takes it up, Hale is looking at a criminal proceeding, not a civil one. Men like Hale can manage civil disputes. They have lawyers and money, and they can drag things out until the other side runs out of both. Criminal is different. She paused. Jim Aldis is also a problem for him. Jim knows things. And Jim is smart enough to understand that when a ship starts going down, the men who cooperated earliest tend to fare the best. Samuel was quiet for a moment. You think Aldis will talk? I think Roy Aldis made a choice in the yard that morning, Clara said. When he said he followed the law. I don't think he would have said that 6 months ago. Something changed for him. She looked at Samuel. I think when you have a witness ready to give information to a federal judge, Roy Aldis will encourage his nephew to be forthcoming. She was right. On the 7th day, Jim Aldis walked into Carter Ranch. He was 26 years old, and he looked about 16, standing at the gate in the late afternoon light, with his hat in his hands, and the specific expression of a young man who has understood too late the shape of the thing he agreed to be part of. Clara saw him from the yard and walked over without hurrying. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Jim, she said. He looked past her at the ranch, the way people look at places they have some history with. He had worked here once. He knew the creak of the gate latch, probably. He knew which stall was on the end. I need to tell someone what I know, he said. Before I have to tell it to a judge, and it sounds like I'm only saying it to save myself. He looked at her. I don't want it to sound like that. What I did was wrong. I knew Mr. Carter's father. He was decent to me. Clara looked at him for a moment. "Come inside," she said. He told them everything. He told them about Victor Hale approaching him 18 months after he'd left Carter Ranch, about how Hale had known about the buried creek from a man named Fowler, who had worked the property even longer ago and had his own grudge. He told them about being paid to confirm details from the old documents, not to steal anything. Hale had been careful about that just to confirm what Fowler had described. He told them about the fake geologist, whose name was Davies, and who worked for a land speculation company Hale had an interest in based in Phoenix. He told them about the forged bill of sale, which had been prepared by a lawyer in Flagstaff, who was going to have a very difficult conversation with the Territorial Bar Association. He told them about 3 other ranchers in the valley who had sold under conditions that bore a strong resemblance to what had been done to the Donahues, their barn, and their no-explanation fire. Pete took notes. He wrote fast and didn't look up. When Jim was finished, he looked at his hands. "I don't expect you to say it's all right," he said. "It isn't." "No," Clara said. "It isn't. But you'll let me tell the judge?" "Yes," she said. "Come with us on Thursday. Tell the judge exactly what you told us. All of it." Jim nodded. He stood up and put his hat back on. At the door he stopped. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "how did you know it was me, that I was the one who told Hale about the documents?" "I didn't know it was you specifically," she said. "I knew it was someone who'd been close to this ranch and close enough to the family to hear the story of the buried creek. And I knew that person would eventually understand that cooperating early was better than being the last one holding Hale's luggage when the luggage was taken as evidence." She paused. "I was counting on that." Jim looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, stepped out the door, and was gone. Samuel had been standing in the doorway of the kitchen during the last exchange. He looked at Clara now with an expression that she had stopped trying to interpret in separate components. The respect and the warmth and the something more had become inseparable in his face when he looked at her, and she had stopped pretending she didn't know what it meant. "You were counting on him coming to us," Samuel said. "I was counting on him having enough decency left to make the right choice when the right choice became available," she said. "That's different." "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "I didn't manipulate him. I created conditions where the honest thing and the self-interested thing pointed in the same direction. He chose. That's his." Samuel was quiet. "My father would have liked you," he said. It was the simplest thing he had said to her. It landed the way simple things land, when they carry the full weight of what the person saying them means, not lightly, not as a pleasantry, but with the specific gravity of a man offering something he considers to be one of the highest things he has to offer. Clara looked at him. "I think I would have liked him too," she said. Thursday came clear and hot with the particular ferocity of August in the territory, the kind of day that burns the edges off everything and leaves only the essential. Judge Harlan Moss held his session in the back room of the Bellow Creek General Store because the town had no courthouse, and the back room of the general store was the largest enclosed space available, and the law in the Arizona Territory of 1885 was accustomed to making do. Moss was 70 years old and looked like something the country had made from its own materials, weathered and precise, with eyes that had heard too many dishonest things to be interested in anything less than the exact truth. He had been a federal judge for 22 years, and he had the quality of a man who has seen most of what humans do to each other in pursuit of what they want, and who has not been made cynical by it, but has been made very clear. Clara sat beside Samuel at the table that had been placed at the front of the room. Greer sat beside her. On the other side of Greer was a young attorney named Caleb Webb, who had ridden down from Flagstaff specifically for this proceeding. Greer had retained him out of his own pocket with a note to Clara and Samuel that said simply, "Some things should be done right." The room was full. All of Bellow Creek, it seemed, had found a reason to be in or near the general store on Thursday morning. Clara could feel the attention on her back, like a physical presence, the particular weight of a community that has been watching something develop from a careful distance and has now, at the point of formal consequence, decided to be present for it. Victor Hale sat on the opposite side of the room with his lawyer, a man from Phoenix who cost more than most of the ranchers in the valley earned in a year. Hale's face was composed. He had recovered from the disruption in the yard, had found his way back to the surface confidence that was his natural operating position. He looked like a man who believed that proceedings had outcomes that could be managed. He had not yet understood that this particular proceeding had already been determined not by anything that would happen in the next 2 hours, but by everything that had happened in the 6 weeks before them. Judge Moss called the session to order. Greer presented first. He was methodical and authoritative, and used language precise enough to be unassailable, and he walked the judge through the spring survey with the patience of a man who has explained complex things to important people for 4 decades, and understands that the foundation has to be laid before the structure will stand. He presented the 1873 water claim. He presented the renewal filing. He presented his survey results. He presented the forged bill of sale with the anachronistic date formatting annotated in red ink in the margin. Hale's lawyer objected to the forgery characterization. Moss overruled him with a brevity that suggested the judge had formed his own view of the document and did not require counsel's assistance revising it. Jim Aldis testified next. He was nervous in the way young men are nervous before judges, not dishonestly, but visibly in the manner of someone who has decided to do a difficult thing and is doing it without pretending it isn't difficult. He told the same story he had told at the kitchen table, in the same words, with the same specific quality of a man not editing himself. He named Davies. He named the Phoenix lawyer. He described the night the forged document was placed on the Carter property, and when Moss asked him how he knew Jim, said, "Because I was told about it afterward by the men who did it. I wasn't there, but I knew." When Jim stepped down, Clara looked at Hale across the room. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his lawyer in the particular way of a man conducting a rapid silent renegotiation with someone he is paying a great deal of money, which told her everything she needed to know about how Hale was experiencing this morning. Then Moss said, "Mrs. Whitmore." She stood up. She had prepared. She had spent the previous 2 evenings at the kitchen table, Samuel across from her Pete, with his notes, the lamp burning long, organizing everything she knew into the form that a federal judge would need to receive it. Not emotional, not rhetorical, factual and sequential and supported at every point by documentation or witness testimony that was already in the record. Her father had taught her that the most powerful thing you can do in any proceeding is make the truth easy to follow. Let the truth do the work, he used to say. Your job is just to clear the path. She stood before Judge Moss, and she cleared the path. She explained the fence-cutting pattern and what it had been designed to produce. She explained the cattle drift and the legal mechanism it was meant to trigger. She explained the fake geologist and how she had identified the western pasture as Hale's specific target. She explained the timeline, the 6 years of land acquisition, the sequence of ranchers who had sold under pressure the Donahue fire that no one had investigated. She explained Jim Aldis's information and how it connected to Davies and the Phoenix lawyer. She explained the night the forged document had been placed and how they had recovered it before it could serve its intended purpose. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not appeal to sentiment. She did not ask for sympathy for the widow who had crossed the desert with a dying horse and arrived at a ranch where a good man was being slowly dismantled by a powerful one. She did not need to. The facts did what they did without decoration. When she was finished, Judge Moss looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "how did you come to be at Carter Ranch?" She had not expected that question. "My horse needed water," she said. "Mr. Carter opened his gate." Moss looked at her for another moment. Something moved behind his old eyes, not sentiment, something more durable than that. "You may sit down," he said. Hale's lawyer spoke for 45 minutes. He was technically skilled and very expensive, and it did not matter because the record in front of Judge Moss was what it was, and no amount of skilled technical language changes what a record contains. Moss took a recess of 20 minutes. When he came back, he did not take long. The water rights claim was confirmed valid and uncontestable. The forged bill of sale was referred to the federal prosecutor with Moss's personal recommendation for full criminal investigation. The fake surveyor's activities were referred to the territorial attorney general. Victor Hale was ordered to cease all contact with Carter Ranch property and personnel pending the criminal investigation. And then Judge Moss said one more thing. He looked at Hale directly, not at his lawyer at Hale, and he said in the voice of a man who has been doing this for 22 years and has earned the right to say what he actually thinks. In 22 years on the federal bench, I have seen a great many men confuse accumulation with right. They are not the same thing. This court will continue to notice the difference. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not. People moved and talked, and the back room of the general store became the thing. It became when everyone in a small community has been waiting for a long time for a specific piece of news and has finally received it. Clara felt hands she didn't recognize on her shoulder. She heard Pete's voice somewhere behind her saying something emphatic and probably not entirely polite. She heard Greer speaking to the young attorney in the quietly satisfied tones of two professionals, acknowledging work well done. And then she heard Victor Hale's voice cutting through the noise. "Carter!" She turned. Hale was standing at the edge of the room, his lawyer a step behind him, and he was looking at Samuel with the expression of a man who has had something taken from him and is deciding how to wear it. "This isn't finished," Hale said, quietly, almost reasonably. Samuel looked at him steadily. "Victor," he said with the particular calm of a man standing on ground he knows is his. "Yes, it is." Hale held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned and walked out. Samuel watched him go. Then he turned and found Clara standing beside him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because the last 2 hours had been everything they'd spent 6 weeks building toward, and the arrival of the thing you've been building toward always requires a moment to simply stand in. Clara said, "Greer wants to buy us a meal." Samuel looked at her. "He's been carrying a debt he thinks he owes," she said. "Let him." "All right," Samuel said. They ate at the table in the back room, after almost everyone else had cleared out Clara and Samuel and Greer and Pete and Caleb Webb, who turned out to be a young man of dry humor and considerable appetite, and Jim Aldis, who came in last and stood at the door until Clara pulled out a chair and looked at him in a way that made the choice clear. The meal was simple, and the conversation was mostly about other things. Pete talked about the east fence, which still needed proper repair. Greer talked about the aquifer findings and what they meant for the valley in technical terms that Clara followed and everyone else absorbed at the edges. Webb talked about the Phoenix lawyer and what the Bar Association would likely do with the referral. Jim Aldis was mostly quiet, but he ate, and occasionally someone included him, and he answered when spoken to, and that was enough for now. At some point in the late afternoon, Clara looked around the table and thought about a morning 8 months ago when she had ridden away from a house where men were changing the locks and told herself she was going somewhere. She had not known where. She had known only forward, which was the direction you ride when everything behind you has closed. She had not known there was a gate at the end of the desert. She had not known that a man with steady eyes and a quiet way of making room for people would open it. She had not known that what she was riding toward was not just a new situation, but herself, the version of herself her father had built, that her marriage had sheltered that grief and loss, and a year of starting from nothing had buried under exhaustion. She had not known she was still there under all of it intact, capable exactly as her father had made her. She knew now. When the meal was over and the others had drifted out, Clara and Samuel rode back to Carter Ranch in the cooling late afternoon, side by side on the wide road, their horses' footfalls steady on the packed earth. The mountains were gold going purple the way they go at that hour. The ranch came into view at the top of the last rise, before the gate, the barn, the house, the trough, where she had first stood with her hand on Daisy's neck, and let herself stop holding everything together. From up here, she could see the repaired north fence line and the west pasture where the buried creek ran 40 feet below the surface, running as it had run for decades, steady and patient and absolutely indifferent to the arguments of men. Daisy was in the pasture nearest the barn, grazing with the comfortable authority of a horse who knows her ground. Samuel reined up at the top of the rise and looked at the ranch the way he looked at it sometimes, not taking inventory, not planning, just looking the way you look at something you love that you almost lost. "My father used to stop here," he said, "every time he came back from town. He said a man should always see what he's coming home to before he walks inside it." Clara looked at the ranch. Home. The word had stopped being something she held at a distance. "He was right about that too," she said. Samuel looked at her. In the late afternoon light, with the mountains behind her and the ranch below them, and everything they had built in the last 6 weeks settled into the permanence of things that have been tested and held. He looked at her with everything in his face that he had been careful about until now. Not careful because he didn't feel it. Careful because he was a man who had learned that the things worth saying should be said when the time for them is right and not a moment before. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not for the ranch, not for the water rights or the fence line or anything that needs doing. I'd like you to stay because—" He stopped. He looked at the ranch and then back at her, and she saw in him the same thing she had seen in herself on the night she had arrived and lain on the narrow bed and let herself deflate into the first real rest she'd had in months. The specific relief of a person who has been alone with something heavy for a very long time and is only now in the presence of someone who could share the weight, understanding how heavy it actually was. "Because this stopped being just mine some time ago," he said. "And I think it stopped being just mine because you're supposed to be part of it." The evening was very still. Somewhere below them, Daisy lifted her head from the grass and looked up toward the ridge with the mild attention of a horse who recognizes her person's silhouette at a distance. Clara thought about what her father had told her the last time she'd seen him, the summer before he died when she was 22 and newly married and full of the particular confidence of someone who has not yet been tested seriously. "The land will hold you, Clara, if you know how to read it. And if you find someone who knows how to read it the same way you do, you hold on to that." She looked at Samuel Carter. She said, "I'm already home." He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The thing that moved across his face was the thing that has no word in any language more specific than home, which is not a place and not a person, but what happens between a place and a person when they are exactly right for each other. They rode down to the ranch together as the last light held the mountains and then let them go. Daisy came to the fence when Clara rode through the gate and pressed her nose against her hand, warm and certain the way animals greet the people they belong to. Clara stood in the yard of Carter Ranch and looked at the house and the barn and the repaired fence and the west pasture above which a federal water claim now stood documented and permanent and unassailable, and she thought, "I came here with nothing." She had been wrong about that. She had come here with everything that mattered. She had come with her father's teaching in her hands, and her mother's resilience in her spine, and 7 years of a good marriage steady in her chest, and the knowledge, hard-won and permanent, that she could cross the desert and arrive somewhere and make it mean something. She had come here with all of that. She just hadn't known it yet. The gate to Carter Ranch stood open behind her, the way it had stood open on the first morning, and in the last light of the August evening. The land held everything it had always held beneath it. The water, the history, the long patience of ground that does not care about the arguments of men, but simply continues to be what it is, waiting for people worthy of it to arrive. Clara Whitmore had arrived, and she was never leaving again.